Okay, so this is the Bible study for Genesis chapter 25. And the text says Abraham had taken another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimram, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan was the father of Sheba and Dedan. The descendants of Dedan were the Asherites, the Letushites, and the Leumites. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, Eldah. All these were descendants of Keturah. Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac, but while he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them away from his son Isaac to the land of the east. Abraham lived 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years, and he was gathered to his people. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, in the field of Ephron son of Zohar the Hittite, the field Abraham had bought from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah, and after Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived near Beer Lahai Roi. This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Ishmael, whom Sarah's slave Hagar the Egyptian bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, listed in order of their birth: Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael; Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedema. These were the sons of Ishmael, and these are the names of the 12 tribal rulers according to their settlements and camps. Ishmael lived 137 years. He breathed his last and died, and he was gathered to his people. His descendants settled in the area from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt, as you go toward Asher, and they lived in hostility toward all the tribes related to them. This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean from Padam Aram, and the sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb. The two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out, with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once, when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." That is why he is also called Edom. Jacob replied, "First sell me your birthright." "Look, I'm about to die," Esau said. "What good is the birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank and then got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. All right, so that's our chapter, and there's a lot in there. Maybe we could have Maybe it feels like we could have skipped over some more of the genealogy stuff that's showing up and focused on the stories like we said we are. I'd really like to focus on the stories. This story that the chapter closes with is probably one of the more powerful and prominent stories of the Old Testament that has a lot of meaning even to us today. So that's we're going to spend more time, I hope, talking about that than the rest of the text. But I don't always feel good about skipping over things that I feel like God put in there for a reason. So uh, remember that you can download a PDF copy of this Bible study so that you can follow along with us as we study the text. And number one on our Bible study says, what happened in last week's Bible study in the last part of chapter 24. Chapter 24 is the story of um, Isaac marrying Rebecca. And the beginning of the text, which was 2 weeks ago in our Bible study, Abraham made his servant promise not to get a wife for Isaac from among the Canaanites, but to go back to Abraham's people. So he did that. It was such a long chapter that we split it up, even though it's really all about the same thing. And at the end, we find the servant coming back with Rebecca. The family said, we believe this is God's will too. She said she was willing to go. She saw Isaac, who was in the field meditating when they were approaching. She covered herself up, and Isaac took her into his mother's tent and married her. And so that's what happened. That's what leads up to this. So um, now all of a sudden, um, they're Isaac's 40, and then we get some background of other families that are connected to Abraham, and then Isaac's 60, 20 years later by the time um, he's having Jacob and Esau, or Rebecca's having Jacob and Esau. So number two, what do we learn now in 25, 1 through 8? Let's ignore this. It looks like genealogy and family names. It kind of is, except for, this is. So when we. Um, when we study further on into the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, we hear people groups that are named for the father of that people group. And those people groups have their source in these in Abraham. The surrounding peoples have their source in Abraham very often, or Abraham's family. So when we see these names, I think a lot of times we have no context for the biblical story that we're reading and how the people groups that are interacting, either at war or at peace or making treaties or whatever it is, we have no concept of how they are related and what their past history is. But I would say that the past history and how they're connected has a huge bearing on how they interact in the future. Those cultures have a long memory. And I think in America, I enjoy watching the comedian Nate Bargatze, and he's a clean comedian, and I think he's funny because he presents things in a way that it's funny. It makes me laugh. But he tells a joke about going to Europe, and he says everything there is so old. And he said, "What y'all been doing over here?" Because the truth is that America traces our roots back only about 250 years. Basically, we've been a nation almost 250 years, right? And some of these we're talking in the Middle East when we're talking about Israel and these Arab nations surrounding them. We're talking about this stuff was over 2,000 years ago that we're reading. So um, the amount of information we have about the peoples who lived in the Americas 2,000 years ago, very small. We know that I know this is controversial and difficult to talk about, but when Europeans came to America, there were people living here. And some of the folks in our church that are learning this with us are descended from the people that were living here already, and some of the folks in our church are descended from the folks that showed up here, and decided to settle. Um, and that's difficult to process. But nonetheless, that was still only 250, 300 years ago. Um, the amount of information, and I know we have some national park sites with even here in New Mexico with indigenous people that go back much further than the sort of currently existing tribes that we have now, that many of these tribes probably were descended from. But the amount of information that we have about those people is so limited. What we have about Israel and the Arab nations right here in scripture preserved and in other sources is much more extensive than what we have about anybody that was over here in America. So I say all that to say that they have a long memory. When we can't figure out why they can't just get along, it's because they remember what the other tribes did to them. They remember back the generations. They have record of bad dealings going way back, of blessings and curses, and how God was interacting with people, uh, and it's hard for some of them to let that go. And we don't understand any of this. See, we watch the news, and we don't seem to understand why they can't all just get along. And maybe it would be helpful for us to pay a little more attention to passages like this. I'll just say that. That being said, um, I don't want us to spend the whole Bible study digging into who each of these people were, but I'd love for you to take note that you've heard these names before. For instance, Midian. Um, Midian is a name that we will certainly hear later on in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and not even that far later on. So I'm just saying we have these names here. Um, let's see. Whoa, wait a minute, this changes everything. And now we're not talking about names, we're talking about Abraham had another wife. Abraham, it talks about the sons of Abraham's concubines. And we sort of try to look into. Um, I know that modern Americans, when Christians talk about biblical definition of marriage, it's easy to point the finger at Christians when they say that, largely because one, we don't have a tendency to do a very good job at being biblical in our relationships, and being godly in our relationships within the church. And so, if we don't represent what that should be, then we don't have much standing to talk about it. And then, second, there's a clear difference between what God teaches us in the New Testament and literally, you know, um, hundreds and maybe thousands of years after this, what God teaches us versus what was practiced when God was beginning to interact with people who were coming out of their old way of life and their old culture. So I would say that Paul is very clear on what he thinks about what is appropriate in terms of um, how many spouses we should have, and the model is one. Um, he's very clear about sexual immorality and how problematic it is, which includes adultery or sleeping with somebody who is not your wife. Even when we get up to the Ten Commandments, we find out that there's some things that were practiced here that should not be practiced moving forward. And so this shouldn't change everything. We're going back to before those things, and this happened, and we need to be careful about judging. And we're really good at judging the past by today's standards. That's what we do all the time, because we have a certain level, a standard of freedom, and a certain standard of um, inclusiveness, and unity and harmony across different cultural backgrounds today, that obviously was not practiced even 50 years ago or 100 years ago in America. And then we judge somebody who did a bunch of good stuff, but for instance was a slave owner. Do we think it's okay to own slaves? No. We don't think that's okay. We are quite, I think, I just speak for me, quite embarrassed about our history of thinking this was okay. um, the history of our people. I mentioned already the interaction between natives and people of European descent. I'm quite embarrassed about how Europeans handled things when they came to America and how they interacted with the people that were here before we were. I had nothing to do with it. I hope that I'm trying to make up for it with my attitude towards others. Um, but but judging somebody for our standard today, when there was a different standard and way of doing things back then, um, and certain things were accepted back then that would never be accepted now. It's so hard to go back and judge. So for instance, in this case, Abraham didn't have the law. See, this is before the law, and it's before the apostles gave instructions for the church. This was the custom of the time, and it created problems. Let's not go back to it. In other words, we can look back and say there were problems. I mean, look at the interaction between Sarah and Hagar. It didn't go well. There were problems. Let's not go back to it. It's good that we've come forward, but at the same time, is it possible to recognize the righteousness of Abraham, according to what he knew, and say that he was righteous according to what he knew of God at that time, without affirming some of the things that he did? I think we have to be able to do that. We're not good at doing that in America today, obviously, but we have to be able to. Otherwise, we find ourselves in quandaries all the time, trying to erase history because somebody did some good things, but also did some things that we would not be okay with today. Um, Abraham had taken another wife. Didn't he learn the first time that this was a bad idea? And that's referring to Sarah and Hagar. Um, Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac. And so, by the way, our custom today is, at least people of means, all other things being equal, for families usually to split it among their children. That was not the custom of the day. The custom of the day was Isaac. I know Ishmael was the firstborn, but he was illegitimate with this. This was not the child that God had promised to bring. This was the child that came because they didn't trust in God. And so Isaac was the child of promise. Isaac was the child that was blessed. He had the birthright. He had, and by the way, the birthright becomes an important thing as we move down here. So understanding, even as we read about Isaac, how significant that was. Isaac had the birthright. What did that mean? Abraham gave gifts to his other children and sent them away, and everything else that Abraham owned belonged to Isaac. And so the majority of the inheritance was Isaac's. That's what the birthright was. That's why it becomes important with Jacob and Esau. See, if we skip over some of this stuff about the birthright, and it doesn't specifically say birthright, but it does say Abraham gave everything he owned to Isaac. But before he died, he gave gifts like, here's your starting money. Now go away, because otherwise there's going to be fighting between you and Isaac, right? So he sent them to settle and live somewhere else with sort of a starting stipend, and then Isaac got everything else, and that's the way it was going to be. That's not how we would do it today, probably, but that was the custom and the standard. Um, let's see. Um, I think there's some catching up in here. This isn't all in line with the story chronologically. So that's absolutely right. So he says this is what happened with this wife and the children she bore, and this is what happened with Ishmael's descendants. And then we're going to return to the story of Isaac, which is really the story that the author wants to tell for the people of Israel when it's written. Um, so G, we also learn about Ishmael's family and his death. So this is a bit of a side note for sure. Yeah, so this is a bit of a side note all the way down here through verse 18. Yeah. Number three, what does 25:19 through 20 say? This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padam Aram, and the sister of Laban the Aramean. So this is just all the details. He was 40. Um, um, Scholars suggest that she was about 14. I think Pastor Dave helped us with that a couple weeks ago. Um, so that would also not be okay in our modern culture, but that was the norm back then, and actually wasn't too far off the norm. Um, 100 or 150 years ago, honestly, in some parts of America. So, um, we're awfully arrogant about how we sit as judges of history. I do think that we can do things better, and things should certainly change from where they've been. But sitting in judgment on history is kind of a crazy thing that we seem to um, think is our duty, I guess now. Number four, what is happening then in 25, 21 through 23? A. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. This is true. We learn that these twins were born when he was 60. So they had been married 20 years by the time they were born, and she was still childless. B, the Lord answered his prayer and his wife became pregnant. Yes, and he must have prayed too hard. C, the babies, maybe he prayed too hard, jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So I think it's funny because so many people that have struggles with fertility today get medical assistance with fertility, and it happens really often that they end up with twins or triplets or things like this. Isaac's plan was prayer, and it also worked maybe a little better than he had anticipated. Um, D, she inquired of the Lord. In other words, she was asking, why is this happening to me? And he spoke to her about the future of her children. So this was before ultrasounds. I'll just say, maybe I ought to not say, but when Ethan was born, we had ultrasounds. We looked at the outside like this around the belly, and we could generally see whether it's a boy or girl, things like that. Certainly, if it was twins. Nowadays, let me just say, by the time Brennan was born, things got a lot more intrusive. If you haven't had a baby in the last 14 years, you may not know, but they now do ultrasounds from the outside and from the inside, which is a little stunning. If you haven't been through that, it's a little jarring, and they can tell a lot. Um, their ultrasound was, let's ask God what's wrong. So she didn't know she had twins, right? Maybe she did. Maybe she could figure it out, but she didn't know. She didn't know what was happening, why things were so turbulent within her, and she didn't have any ultrasound. She just asked God, what's going on? And God said, there's two nations within you, and one, the younger will serve the older, and they're going to be at odds here. um so, number five, what happened when they were born, according to 25, 24 through 28? A, there were twin boys. So now we know, like for sure, what God was saying is true. There's two in there, and they were different from birth. Like from the time they came out, they were named according to what they looked like or what they were doing when they were born, and there was a clear difference from the beginning. B, the first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. So he was named Esau, which means hairy. Now we're told later in the story that Edom means red. It also says that he was red when he came out. But the red apparently is for a different reason. So he was named Esau. His descendants became the Edomites. So when he is called Edom, that's important because we see Edom happen or show up in Scripture a lot throughout the rest of the Old Testament, particularly. Uh, After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, almost as if within the belly they were arguing over who was going to come out first. And Esau came out first, but Jacob was trying to pull him back. So his name, Jacob's name, means the heel grasper or the usurper, the one that tries to get ahead of the other one, which apparently grasping the heel was sort of an idiom for trying to get ahead or trying to pull oneself ahead. D, Isaac was 60 years old, so we learn that too now. Number six, what do we learn in 25, 29 through 30? Once, when Jacob, so again, we're not hearing the story of their whole life, just some important moments. So, this transition, once, when Jacob was cooking some stew, tells us that we're not hearing everything that happens in their life, but we are going to now, we heard the story of their birth, which had some significant prophecy surrounding it. It had some significant sort of foreshadowing in the way they were born. Then we're told that there's something very different about them throughout their life. And there was this one time that sort of illustrated the difference between the boys. So we're going to hear this story that happened one day, as probably after they had grown up or as they were a certain age, and here we go. B, Jacob was cooking some stew, and Esau came in from open country famished. So we're told also that Esau went out and hunted, and that's what he was like to do. He was an outdoorsman. Jacob seemed to be the favorite of his mom rather than his dad, and seemed to spend his time in camp. Maybe we could say was more of a farmer than a hunter gatherer. Okay, fine. Today, um, you know, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, when I was a kid, we might have said one thing about one boy being an outdoorsman and the other boy spending time in the kitchen with his mother. Today, we say an entirely different thing. And what we said 35 years ago probably is inappropriate today. I don't know. But older people still say it and then and get canceled and corrected, I'm sure. Um, but uh, but but culture changes, and what we think about the appropriateness of that changes with it. There's nothing in this text that says anything is wrong with either one of these in terms of how they choose to, where they choose to spend their time and what their giftings are, and that sort of thing. Um, on the other hand, um, what how they respond to what is going on, I think there is some judgment about it. See, Esau asked for some of the red stew. That was why he was called Edom, apparently, not because he came out of the womb red. And we are told that here. He's called Edom because of the red stew he asks. So the fact that he sold his birthright for some stew that was red changed his name forever. So his character went from being the hairy one, the bold one, the outdoorsman, the manly man, to the one who was willing to give up his birthright because he was hungry for some food. And so that is not a great change in name and what you're known for. I will say Jacob's name was changed later, and it was a much more positive change and reasoning. Um, Number seven, how did Jacob respond to Esau's request in 25:31? He said, "First, sell me your birthright. You're desperate. You're hungry. You want you want this stew. First, sell me your birthright." That's pretty rough. That seems like so. As we sort of sit in judgment on this story and the characters therein, we sort of think, you know, Jacob is kind of a trickster. He's playing on, and by the way, he ends up being sort of the good guy in the story, but it's hard for us to process why he's the good guy when he does something that doesn't seem great here. And so he says he takes advantage of his brother when he's hungry, to make him promise to give up his birthright. Now, that being said, also, it seems as if um, Esau took the birthright lightly. We could also say that God's word about them, the prophecy that came about them, was that the older would serve the younger. So this all fulfilled the will of God. Um, so what are we to say about that? Now, it also seems so Esau gives up his birthright quickly. What was Esau's response in 25:32-33? He says, "What's the point of a birthright if I die? I'm hungry and I'm gonna die, and none of the birthright will be any good to me." Now, was he really about to die? If he was, then that's a logical argument. But if he wasn't, um, most commentaries suggest sort of he took it lightly, and he maybe wasn't as about to die. I don't know if you have kids that come in and say they're hungry. What do we have to eat? You suggest something, and then they say, "No, I don't want that." I saw a great video the other day that says, "Then you're not hungry." If you don't want that, you want food, but you're not hungry, because if you were hungry, you'd eat anything. So our kids don't know what it is to be hungry, most of them, and so they just want food. That's different, and but they think that's what it means to be hungry. And I just wonder, how hungry was Esau really? How close to death was he really? Because the commentaries say that he took his birthright lightly. And actually, we're going to talk about this toward the end here, but at the end it says, "So Esau despised his birthright." And many of the commentaries suggest that what they mean by that, what the author meant by that, is that he took it lightly. He didn't take it seriously. He got rid of it for something that was of short term value. So he didn't fully understand its value. So he despised it because he didn't think it was as valuable as it really was. So then, number 8 is probably maybe the most important question of this whole text. Do we ever trade a momentary desire for our own long term good? And I would say we do far too often. We will be so enthralled with a momentary pleasure that we'll trade our long term relationship with God for it. Um, People who have an affair trade their family, their spouse, the good of their children for whatever they get out of the affair, whether it's sexual pleasure, whether it's emotional fulfillment. Studies suggest that different people have affairs for different reasons. That women tend to have affairs less often because of sexual gratification and much more often because of emotional connection and fulfillment that they're not getting within their relationship. That doesn't justify it, but it's just what statistics say. In fact, um, when we're talking about why pastors fall from ministry, most of them in sort of the post-mortem or in the after studies of what happened, were not taking care of their relationships, the importance of their primary relationships, their spouse. They were struggling with mental health because of the strain of ministry, and we're not having accountability, and we're not having good mental health support when they needed it there, and therefore the affair uh, is often an escape, not even a desire for physical pleasure. All of that to be said, all that aside, none of that really matters because all of it is the same. Why? What is my momentary desire? What is the fulfillment that I'm seeking right now that I would trade my long-term good for? And the answer is it's not always the same thing, but we too often trade our long term good for some short term fulfillment or pleasure. Um, Eating stew, I say that maybe at least in part because eating stew in and of itself is not evil. Um, just like in Genesis, eating a fruit is not in and of itself evil, but it was against the will of God. And because it was trading something, God's blessing, trading something wonderful for something that we desire in the moment, that is the evil of it. Number 9, what do we learn in 25:34? Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank and then got up and left. Like, it doesn't show any regret. It doesn't say that after he was full, he couldn't believe what he had done. That's why another reason why commentators say that he despised his birthright. He didn't take it seriously. He didn't value it. He didn't even seem to have regret afterwards. Although I would argue that at the time when it was time for it to be passed on, he still expected to get it. And then we sort of demonize Jacob for tricking, and I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, a couple chapters, but for tricking his dad Isaac into getting that birthright. But maybe that wasn't so wrong, given that that Esau was going to go ahead and take that despite having swore an oath that he would trade it. So Number 10, what does it mean that Esau despised his birthright? A, yeah, I don't know. B, he did not hold it with the value it was worth. He didn't take care of it or protect it. And there are some other ideas out there, certainly, and I've talked with our staff and folks about those in recent days. But I think a lot of the commentary suggests that this is the primary meaning of that. So we need to think about it. We need to consider it before we make our decisions. Are we trading our long term good for some short term fulfillment?